I am so excited to welcome all of you to this webinar today, and just wanted to briefly give you our code of conduct and land acknowledgement. AMC and AMC Foundation offices are in New York, location situated upon the unceded seized territory of the Lenape and Carnacy peoples, and benefited from the economies of slavery and the labors of African descended captives. We own our existence and vitality to generations from around the world who were brought here against their will, drawn here to escape persecution, and some that have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. We pay respect to their communities, past and present. This acknowledgement asks us each to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. AMC and AMC Foundation programs, events, and opportunities respect the rights, differences, and dignity of others. Those taking part in AMC activities are expected to demonstrate honesty, integrity, respect, and civility to those activities, and are accountable for their conduct with our team, board members, guests, and supporters. AMC reserves the right to suspend services, to exclude from participation in AMC and its programs any person whose inappropriate behavior adversely affects the safety, well-being, and inclusion of community and team. Our full code of conduct policy for this and all of our programs, as well as the outlets to make a direct or anonymous report of a violation, has been posted in the chat feature. This program requires all attendees and speakers to follow our code of conduct, which you can read, which I'll post. And I encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A box for our panelists. Thank you for attending, and now to begin.
Thank you, Emma. Hello and a warm welcome to all who are joining us for this webinar, Environmental Ethics of Commissioning and Exhibition Making. My name is Megan Fontanella. My pronouns are she, her. I am an art historian, curator, and strategic leader with the Guggenheim in New York, and I am delighted to serve as the moderator for this webinar. This webinar is hosted by the AMC Foundation's Engagement for International Curators Program Fellows with generous support from Art Fund. As the climate crisis worsens, we observe a rise in exhibitions on the topic of environmental responsibility. We also question the costs of exhibition making to our planet. How may we ensure that creating, displaying, and stewarding art is aligned with our environmental commitments? We are in the business of preserving culture, but how do we address evolving value systems and reimagine the future of climate impact? How may we cultivate and embed a sustainability mindset that benefits the artists, the institutions, and the communities we serve? So at the Guggenheim, we have embraced the following sustainability principles. Question everything, foster collaboration, consider timing, think forward, track progress, educate, and illuminate. And in the spirit of mutual learning, I am eager to hear from my colleagues on this panel and to discuss further opportunities to adapt, innovate, and transform art world practices to mitigate environmental impact. As Emma said, we encourage folks to submit questions via the Q&A function. We will endeavor to address as many questions as possible. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our three speakers whose full bios are available on the AMC website, artcurators.org. So first off, we have Kim Kraczon, who is Director of Waste and Materials at Kai Culture and a founding member of the Gallery Climate Coalition Berlin. As a conservator of modern materials and contemporary art, Kim's focus is mitigating the environmental burden of materials and methods in art production, exhibition, and fine art shipping. Nena Okore is an acclaimed environmental artist and professor at Chicago's North Park University. She engages ecological problems, including current waste issues, through her arts-based participatory practice. And last but not least, Sarah Wade is an art historian and lecturer in the Department of Art History and World Art Studies based in the Sainsbury Center for Visual Arts at University of East Anglia. Her research examines human-animal relations and representations of wildlife in contemporary art, exhibitions, and museum displays, particularly with regards to ecological concerns. So I'm now going to invite each of the speakers to share a short presentation, beginning with Kim, and then we'll get into our discussion and again, try to address your questions. So thanks.
All right, thank you, Megan, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of this webinar. I'm very thrilled to be here. So Megan just said I'm a conservator, actually, of contemporary art and modern materials. And how I got into the topic of sustainability was I was working as the resident conservator at Studio Olafur Eliasson in Berlin. And anyone who's familiar with his work knows that he focuses on climate change often. And of course, I spent a huge chunk of my time there researching alternative materials for production and in particular, packaging materials and shipping methods, because we shipped most of the artwork directly from the studio. And I wanted to start with this slide because it illustrates the environmental impact of the art sector, which has carbon emissions equivalent to Austria, which is not as large as other sectors, but still fairly hefty. So next slide, please. We can continue. Yeah, so from the studio and my research, I linked up with Key Culture, and in particular, the founding CEO, Caitlin Southwick, and was at the helm of the Waste and Materials Keybook, which is an online sustainability manual for collections care, packing, storage, and transport. This is the cover. It's free to download for anyone who's not familiar with the keybook. There's also an energy and a social sustainability keybook. But in the keybook, we focused on mitigating waste, reducing waste, using the waste hierarchy. I have since publishing the keybook in 2020, I've moved towards the zero waste hierarchy, which incorporates elements of circularity. And that's sort of, I think, where we need to move. There's definitely a few edits that are necessary in the keybook. We're working on them as we speak. Next slide, please. But there's still some basic information there. A lot of it's focusing on the traditional packaging materials that we use in cultural heritage, alternative options, but also, at the center of this, or what I hope to at least emphasize in the next edition is reducing and reusing, and not really placing all of our hopes into these alternative materials necessarily. I also work very, very closely with Gallery Climate Coalition, who's known for their online carbon calculator. I'm working on various projects there. A few years ago, I worked with the Packaging and Materials Research Committee with a bunch of registrars and art handlers and other conservators, and we sort of came together and came up with guidelines. I also work closely with the galleries that are involved with GCC and sort of help them test packaging materials that I feel like are environmentally friendly. I know these are very loaded words. You can see here, this is from White Cube Gallery. And I also am working currently at GCC on, oh yeah, I forgot about this slide, sorry. Yeah, we did a waste sort of audit analysis at Frieze, London last year, and I've been working with art fairs on reducing the carbon footprint and also waste. As you can see here, it's fairly monumental at these art fairs. So that's been an aim of ours at GCC. I also am working on artist resources at the moment, artist guidelines, and as forward thinking, and this is something I feel very, very passionately about, is a calculator for materials that isn't solely focused on the carbon footprint, but also incorporates other impact categories, including human toxicity and environmental justice issues as well, which I feel like when you make choices as far as what materials to use for exhibition making, for art production, these factors are often, at least at this moment, everyone's so hyper-focused on the carbon footprint, and we need to sort of have a more holistic approach to materials moving forward, along with a low carbon footprint. And this is another project with National Trust that I'm working on in the UK, just looking at sustainable soft packaging or soft wrap options for art, mostly paintings or paintings conservators. And that's, I think, sums it all up. Those are all my projects that I'm working on at the moment.
Great, thanks, Kim. Go ahead, jump in.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Megan, for that beautiful introduction, and thanks to the Curator's team for inviting me to participate in this webinar. And I think Kim gave such a beautiful introduction to some of the concerns that I've had in my own practice. And for a long time, I think one of the biggest concerns I've heard is that we've not been having these conversations enough, especially in the contemporary art field. And that has been so troubling to me, given that I ship my work around the world. I have to consider what materials are being expended and what kind of carbon footprint I'm leaving behind. And so for a very long time, it has been a nagging issue for me. And I have been bothered by the fact that there's been a loud silence around it. I wish that more art academies are addressing these issues and bringing it to the fore. And I applaud you so much, Kim, for this work that you're doing. And I hope that it resonates with many of us. But in my creative practice and my pedagogic research, I'm looking for ways of not just sounding the alarm, but also ways that my actions can contribute to solving the waste problem. And so for me, the last 4 years, I've been drawing on a lot of ideologies from new materialism, especially those of thinkers like Karen Barrett, Jane Bennett, Donna Haraway, and also looking at ways that we can begin to be more aligned with the material environment and giving them a lot of ethical considerations in how we use things and how we expend materials. Further to that, I've also been looking at African animism, for instance, and looking at indigenous knowledge and how we can tap into ways of being and ways of entangling with our planet and the biosystems in a way that allows us to be sensitive to how we expend materials or how we produce waste. Because I think that when we become disembodied from these issues, we tend to use and discard and replace and all of those things. Whereas when we are fully engaged in the fact that these materials have entity and have life force, we can be a little bit more empathetic. And so these are things that I've been working on. And to that end, I've also developed a bioplastic process where I create the plastic from waste materials, especially bio-waste materials like food scraps and food peels and vegetables and things like that. And the idea is to kind of swap out the synthetic materials, because I think it's important to not just visualize issues, but also to find ways of making concrete, like tangible change in the way that we practice as artists. And so that has been sort of my research. And in working with the bioplastic, it doesn't just end in the studio for me. It's also about how to elicit and engender conversation, dialogue, and storytelling with other people in the process. Try to create a lived experience through this. And so I think that it's been a process for me, and I've been making active efforts to invite audiences, to invite participants, creative peers, and so on into my studio, because I want them to experience the work. Like right now, I have some pieces of my bioplastic here, which, you know, I get people to engage and to talk, you know, to feel and to process. My hope is that this sort of brings up ways that we can rethink and reimagine how we exist in this planet and how we can produce a risk-averse culture to the planet. And I'm also pushing back at the notion that works of art need to be immortal. That I think the museum culture for a very long time has been that, you know, the acquisitions, the collections, the conservations have to be of works that can last and last and last, not leave us for centuries to come. And I think that we need to have a change in mindset, and that is why I'm looking to, you know, to elicit for ways that we can make art that is of an experience now, is for art's sake, or sorry, for a life's sake, not for art's sake. That is all about not thinking about it as a commodity or something that has value, but more about the experience that we get from it and the ways that we can engender a coexistence or sort of collaborative process in living on this safely and ethically. So thank you.
Thank you, Nana. Sarah, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for the invitation. It's really great to be involved in the discussions today. We've already sort of observed, I think, through this event that there's been a surge of exhibitions examining environmental crisis in recent years. And this has coincided really with wider public awareness and action in the face of climate change. But this work also has a longer art and exhibition history, which I think can be charted back to the dawn of the modern environmental movement in art and exhibitions in the 1960s and 70s. But nevertheless, the academic work that's related to this environmentally attuned exhibition landscape is a more nascent field of study. And while we've seen the growth of the environmental humanities as a field of academia, curating and curatorial studies are not as prominent as other disciplines in this interdisciplinary field, despite the recent proliferation in practice. So this is something that I've been interested in as an art historian, and also something that my ongoing collaborative research project, Curating the Sea, which is a project with Pandora Siporic, has been focusing on, really observing the specific contribution that curating can make to discussions about the intersections of climate crisis and colonialism, as well as the generative capacity of curatorial methods informed by the materiality and movement of the sea. Alongside this project, my research has focused on artistic and curatorial engagements with wildlife conservation concerns. Also, the ways that historical museum collections are being reinterpreted to reflect contemporary issues pertaining to environmental breakdown. A lot of my work recently has been looking at artistic interventions in the context of natural history museums, for instance, which I think is a really generative model for exploring the entanglements of nature and culture that are inherent to the Anthropocene. So, in summary then, I've been thinking about how curating can make a unique contribution conceptually, theoretically, and also practically to discussions about the current ecological state of play. And today I just want to make 3 quick observations on this activity and suggest what I feel might be a good step forward. So for me, curating in relation to climate crisis has developed around 3 principal areas: content that's focused on climate change and related issues, practices and the ways that these are enacted in sustainable ways, and what I'll refer to as ecological ways of curating. So ways of curating that bring artworks and objects, collections, humans, non-humans into relation with one another, such that humans are sort of enmeshed in the web of earthly life rather than necessarily set apart. And this kind of conceptual idea is also explored by other scholars, including Fiona Cameron, who has written extensively on climate change in museums. Secondly, we started to see different and alternative types of institution being established in response to climate crisis. So even just locally in relation to where I'm currently based in Norfolk, we've got the first and, as far as I know, the only UK gallery with a singular focus on art and the environment at Groundwork Gallery, which is in Kings Lynn. And also in the UK, we have the Climate Museum UK, which is a museum that doesn't have a physical site, and it's run by a distributed network of associates rather than a hierarchical staffing structure, which I think allows for more locally sensitive responses to climate crisis and its impact on specific locations and communities. And then last but not least, we're starting to see specific climate change curatorial posts emerging. So one example would be my colleague, John Kenneth Paranada, who's Curator of Art and Climate Change, where I'm based at the Sainsbury's Centre. And these sorts of roles really consolidate this area of curatorial work as a specific field of practice. So I guess to kind of conclude then, given this proliferation of activity in museums and galleries, as well as the innovations across the sector, what might be good for us to sort of move forward with? Firstly, I think it's important to ensure that climate crisis is integrated into everything that we're doing, where that's feasible, rather than being a sort of add-on. And I also think it's important that we try and make specific contributions from our own institutional and geographical contexts so that curatorial practice can really make a unique and specific and situated contribution to the discussions and the work and action to address environmental crisis. But I also think that collaborative approaches to curating and knowledge sharing are really key, since I think working together presents a richer and more efficient possibility for addressing the ecological crisis in our work. So events like this one, I think, are really important to bring people together to sort of discuss these concerns.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Kim and Nana, again for those opening remarks. I want to jump right in. You've given us so much to think through, and I want to come back to a lot of this, but certainly the idea of circularity and reduce is really important, I think. One of the first things we did at the Guggenheim when we launched our green team a few years ago was do a waste audit to understand what was going to the landfill and how we could divert that. And also, again, questioning everything. Did we need to, for instance, be wrapping collection works that were traveling between our warehouse and our museum site in plastic and using tape, et cetera? And could we, working with registrars and conservators and art handlers, really come to a better way of practice that did, in fact, we did elect to stop wrapping in plastic local collection activity when it was safe to do so. So I think that's a very important question and to think through. No, certainly this idea of degradation, I want to come back to as well, and the idea of how we steward objects into the future. And again, we are institutions that are grounded on preservation, stewardship, and how we rethink those models and again those value systems. And Sarah, this idea of embedding into our very way of being, whether we're curators or other museum professionals, a sustainability mindset is so much at the forefront of how I've been thinking through things. And I appreciate you mentioning that and the ways that we can think of sustainability as part of our so-called core responsibilities or our core duties, and not kind of something happening, off at stage left. So there's a lot to think through. I guess I'll pose this question to Sarah first, this idea, because you brought up this idea of content versus practices. And I think, there's a whole range of institutions, right? Smaller, bigger, who might feel a little daunted, right? Where do I start? Do I start thinking through content about the climate emergency? Do we start shifting, adapting our practices? Ideally both, but I wondered if you had some more thoughts to kind of expand upon where someone can just get started.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, it can seem quite overwhelming, I guess, if you're thinking about sort of shifts in practice across an institution, which can obviously be difficult in a big organisation, let alone a small one where you've got less resources and staffing. But I think making a start is the important thing, and sort of looking for where you can get support as well. In the UK, at least, there are some organisations that offer support for arts organisations, galleries and museums, whether that's through kind of audits of their practice or offering kind of consultation in order to kind of move towards more sustainable ways of working. But I think in an ideal world, I think sustainable practices as well as developing sustainable content would be an ideal approach. And of course, sustainability and issues to do with climate change, they integrate, or they sort of permeate all aspects of our work and our life. They don't necessarily need to be in an exhibition about climate change in order to be addressed, so to speak. But I think it is really important in terms of developing content to realise the sort of power that can have for audiences, because I think there's a recognition that if we're talking about curatorial practice in terms of mounting exhibitions, you can obviously communicate about climate change, but you've also got the ability to be able to activate the emotions that I think can really enhance the sense of connection that people have with these kinds of issues. I think if I was going to say one more thing, it might be that I think it's quite important to be really specific about what aspects of the climate crisis or environmental breakdown you're addressing. I think there's a lot of exhibitions at the moment and in recent years that are exploring climate crisis. I think that audiences have quite a lot of knowledge about related issues now. And when they go to an exhibition, maybe they want to be challenged or find out something new rather than have what they already know reinforced. And I think one way that you can do that is by kind of pushing the boundaries of the kind of subject matters that you're addressing, and also choosing to focus on very specific topics that people might not have thought about in detail.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate your comment too about, it doesn't have to necessarily be an exhibition that's solely focused on the climate emergency. It could be finding ways to work in those conversations. And I would posit too that the very conversation we're having today and those who are joining us in this webinar is a step forward in the right direction, because we are breaking the climate silence. And I think that is so often undervalued, this idea of just talking about it and getting folks, your constituents, your visitors, your communities more comfortable with that idea. And just one simple example, when we organized the 2022 Cecilia Vicuña exhibition at the Guggenheim and decided to make that exhibition a case study for a comprehensive carbon emissions audit, we did end up putting language in our introductory wall text, communicating that to audiences, saying that that the institution was committed to a future-focused, comprehensive, adaptive approach to sustainability, and we were undergoing this audit. And it was just a way of messaging for every single person that went in to see the exhibition that this was underway, that this was part of our value system as an institution. And for us, that felt like, something easy in a way that we could do by incorporating that language into the wall text, but was actually very impactful and sparked conversations. So I appreciate, this idea that one can, you have to start somewhere, right? And sometimes it can be just having a conversation, hosting a conversation. I also want to think through how we collaborate, because I think collaboration is so integral to this work, particular collaborations with living artists, when we commission work, when we invite folks in for exhibitions. And I would even extend this line of thinking to our external vendors, other partnerships, folks that again are in our orbit. And at the Guggenheim, we have under our Director of Sustainability, Whitney McGuire, recently updated our artist agreements so that when we collaborate with an artist, we do have the so-called sustainability clause inviting that individual to work with us in good faith to analyze and minimize the environmental impact of their exhibition or commission. So that was a big step and recent step for us. But Nana, because you are the artist in our midst, I'm curious, what aspects of the commissioning process or exhibition process or art making you have found most helpful or and challenging supporting your environmental work, whether that's just your work in the studio or your encounters with institutions. How can we as curators support you better?
Thank you, Megan. That's really a good question. And I also want to add a comment to what you said about the commitment to, or the commitment to add sustainability models as part of the museum structure. I think is so important to really even beginning to discuss the content, because if there is no commitment from the institution, I think it becomes there's a danger of tokenism where art is or events are being planned without there really being a deep value for those things, for sustainable ways or sustainable approaches. But to your question, I think that for me, one of the best supports that I've received, or the way that I feel most supported, is when I'm given an opportunity to have engagements with audiences, to share my process, to share the materials that I work with, because I think that there is a shift in perspective or shift in perceptions when audiences have the opportunity to actually hold the material in their hand. I did bring with me, like I shared earlier, with my bioplastic, because this is from a remnant from an exhibition that I had recently where I had made bioplastic materials to share with the audience, and it made a whole lot of a difference when they experienced it and felt it, and it just kind of changed the whole perception of how they might even begin to think about sustainability issues and lived experience. So I think for me, particularly, what is helpful is being given the freedom to explore different kinds of materials without the consideration for, preservation or conservation, or even the rules around, can people touch it, the safety, all of those things. I want the work to be embodied. I want people to pick it up. I want people to engage with it. I want it to be an experience, a lived experience. And so that is one way that I find very helpful in addressing this issue, that it really has to be something where people it has to be generative and transformative of an experience. The second thing that I wanted to add in terms of challenges, I think there are there are many protocols when working with formal spaces or formal institutions in terms of how you engage with work. And I would challenge curators to begin to think about it. I know that this is something that's already in practice, but I would challenge curators to begin to also think about ways that we can walk across spaces through technology, because there's an artist, Himo Moddig, who many years ago in 2010 had argued that there needs to be, that he didn't need to be in a performance for that performance to take place. That it could be a situation where he sends in the recipe or sort of like the stages of the performance and have someone on the other end of the wall perform it as a way to kind of extend the experience as well. And so I'm thinking that, in thinking about sustainability models, we also have to be looking at how can we reduce the carbon footprint of travel and, cross-continental sort of migration. I mean, I know it's hard to do that without having the artist present, but we might be successful if we could think about ways of having prescriptions or having different suggestions of how different activities can be performed in different venues without the artist being present. That's something that I know is far-fetched, but it's something worth considering.
Thank you, Nina, because I do feel like this question of travel keeps coming up again and again now, in this world where we are moving around so much more. And it is so important sometimes to be in community with folks in person. But is it a yes and, how can we find moments where, yes, that in person is so critical, but also maybe doing something virtually or having a virtual courier for a loan or, having multitasking when one is traveling. I think these are all questions, again, that say, well, I have to take a trip here. How can I get multiple things done at the same time to make it a really, valuable and less more sustainable experience. And I appreciate that you are encouraging folks to touch your materials. I think that's the dream of most visitors, that they enter a space and are divorced from that relationship between the material and the land. And what we're encouraging folks to do, right, is rethink that relationship to the land and that materiality and moving away, as you said, from synthetic materials to materials that are tied to the land. And understanding how do we produce waste and what does that mean? And can you take that waste and actually create this circularity vis-a-vis your art? I think that's really powerful. So thank you. Since we're talking about materials and shifting mindsets, this is perfect for Kim's entry to think about the sustainable creation and preservation of art, and going back to this idea that Nana and Kim both raised about degradation and ephemerality, and can we think through can we welcome that into the institutional space more often, whether it relates to the creation of art, the acquisition of art, the preservation of art. And Kim, I wondered if you wanted to expand upon that a little bit more, and specifically from a conservation point of view, how are conservators being taught now, perhaps, is a question I would add to that, and how can we kind of shift those ways of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, this is my own personal take on it, and I'm not representative of all conservators, and I'm often told, in fact, that I'm shooting myself in the foot often as a conservator, because I support Nana's philosophy of allowing visitors to touch art objects, and also not to fetishize the art object in a gallery context, and allowing for changes if the artist sanctions it. And this is in conservation, we also see conservators as we want to freeze the condition of artworks for as long as possible, but really conservation is managing change. Is art, there's materials are going to change over time. And so as long as the stakeholders involved in the acquisition, the curators are involved, everyone is aware that there's a set limitation of, okay, this artwork, the artist is allowing for certain changes over time, where this artist perhaps doesn't want their artwork to be kept in the standard museum climate that prevents alterations in color or signs of aging. Then we should allow it. And that just essentially takes altering acquisition protocols, this is something that was brought up by Kirsty Robinson, who's a professor at Western University in Canada. And I've been enchanted with this idea for a few years now. And it's just a matter of having these conversations. And, as a conservator, again, I'm not shooting myself in the foot because it requires this mediation. It requires, understanding how materials are going to change if we don't keep them under the, if we expose them to sunlight, if we, are shipping them with certain materials, understanding what changes might occur and sort of allowing for those, if possible, if everyone's on board with it.
And the key there is conversation, right? So understanding, again, it might not be every situation that's possible, but are there instances, or, I know there's really interesting conversations happening now with contemporary art and media, and thinking through, what an artist might have used 20 years ago in terms of tech components that have now changed, and where there might be actually better options from an environmental standpoint, and how can we have those conversations, aesthetics versus environmental versus, all these different concerns that we have when talking about how a work of art is brought forward now into the 21st century. And I feel like, Kim, you just hit the nail on the head that conversation ideally is happening, at the creation moment, ideally, if an acquisition is being made at every step of the process, so that we understand, how to care for this into the future. Nana, did you have anything to add to this conversation, since you are also thinking through these issues?
No, I think you kind of said it all. Yeah.
Great. And again, it's that change of mindset, because I think so often in the cultural sector, there is a sense of this mandate, we have to be stewards, right? So the art does become very precious. So how can we find ways to navigate that a bit? And then, Kim, thinking through materials even more, I'm curious if there's any, you touched upon a little bit, thinking through different crating and plastic wrapping, et cetera, but any, material innovations that you are particularly excited about? And, we had talked about this idea of there's no silver bullet, and I wondered if you could kind of expand upon that a bit too.
Yeah, sure. My answer was essentially no. Like, I'm not excited about any new development materials, because I've explored most of them, and I keep coming back to, okay, it's about reusing, it's about reducing. There's nothing more impactful we can do. And there's no materials like, even, Nana's using bioplastics that you're, producing yourself, and it's from food waste, and it's something different than the marketed bioplastics, which could mean anything. It could mean, I don't want to get too technical. It's so the foam that we use in packing crates, for example, I've come across examples of foams that claim to be plant-based, when in fact it's the same manufacturing process. Absolutely. To make these foams, but it's only the ethanol that's used is derived from corn, as opposed to it's typically, actually, it's always derived from corn. Like, if there's no difference, it's the one component of this foam is like from corn, the alcohol is from corn that makes this plastic. Therefore, the plastic can be called plant derived. And it's just, it's wild to me. So I definitely, and also, like, as a lifelong science fiction fan, I knew better than to fall for like the promise of the techno utopia when it comes to materials. I should have known, but it's, I've banged my head against the wall for years now. Just, there's every material is new material is kind of a dead end. And, and in conservation, it is difficult because we do need plastics in a lot of cases. There's certain, especially working with the National Trust group of conservators, they had workshops where people basically, like handled the new materials, the bioplastics, and filled out a survey to vet. Essentially, the point being is, if a material isn't functional, what's the point? We can't use it anyhow. But most of the time, like, we came back to plastics. Like, we need to use plastics in a lot of cases. And so what I encourage them to do is then separate their collection into highly susceptible and non-highly susceptible, right? So then they somehow like mark the inventory numbers. So if an artwork, and they're also, it's like historical paintings on like wood panels that are very sensitive to changes in relative humidity and temperature. It's a bit different than contemporary art in a lot of cases, but at least not using a blanket solution, right? That, well, we have to use plastic for everything now, and trying to separate the collection into, okay, there's some artworks that are a bit more robust, maybe we don't need to use plastic necessarily for them. We can use a paper product, paper-based, something that's curbside recyclable, also can be reused, by the way. And then the more highly susceptible, vulnerable artworks that require plastic, yes, we can use plastic, however, like make an effort, obviously, to reuse it and reduce the quantity in the crate. And that's sort of the dual thinking.
Can I jump in and, yeah, may I jump in and just add that I completely agree. I think that being in a capitalist economy, there is absolutely no way that we can, avoid, expending energy or having carbon footprints associated with our actions. However, like you said, Kim, I think it's all about, rethinking what is possible and how we can even begin to make small changes, because those small changes collectively become big changes. And over time, systematically, we can phase out a lot of processes and come up with new, models for packaging, transporting, and whatever it is that needs to be changed. But I think that having that conversation and just being aware that it is possible to do things a little differently, I think matters. And so when I think about my bioplastic process, even though I see it as a carbon neutral process, truly is it when I have to use electricity to process the food that I'm going to, use to create this material? What is that life cycle of the electricity that I'm burning or using? So it's as if nothing is really ever carbon free, or we can't really create in a world today without having all those carbon emissions. But at least we can begin to think about steps that we can take to mitigate it and to cut down so that it starts to be impactful on a larger scale. That's sort of how I take it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nana. I do feel remembering that there's opportunities for impact, whether small or large. It can be incremental, it can be more radical. And Sarah, I want to tease this out a little bit more with your research practice and understanding that curatorial work in particular touches nearly every department and operation of institutions. So there is great potential for impact. So I just want to pull this thread a little bit more. What are some other ways that curators in particular, but all museum professionals, all institutional professionals can think in this more sustainable, mindful manner? Are there new ways of working that we can pull out a little bit more here?
Well, I think quite a few of the obvious things that I might suggest have been sort of teased out already, these ideas of reuse, recycling, thinking twice before you do something. Is there another way? I think Nana's idea about thinking about how we can use digital space to create and make and share is a really interesting area. But I think what is helpful to keep in mind is actually having parameters around what you do, because of the sustainability impact actually can push you to be more creative and to become more radical and maybe more engaging to audiences through what you're doing. So I just thinking of an example to help illustrate, but there was an exhibition at Gropius Bow, Down to Earth, which was essentially like an unplugged exhibition. So there was no electricity, which meant that you had to rely on daylight, event programming. There was obviously no new media work if there was no electricity, but it just allowed scope for the exhibition to take on another life and become something else, and set these kind of creative parameters to do something. The other thing that I'm sort of interested in, which maybe it's not so directly related to your question, but I think it's another interesting area, is taking the exhibition outdoors and the possibilities that this presents to actually have an impact on a habitat or an ecosystem. So I've been really interested in the ways that humans are being decentered through curatorial practice and artistic practice, especially around themes in relation to kind of environmental breakdown. And there's examples of artists and curators who are starting to create interventions in the landscape with a view to better sustaining the local ecosystem. So another example for this would be Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg's project, the Pollinator Pathmaker project, which is essentially a bee garden that's been planted through an algorithm that generates planting that will be really beneficial to the insects in a local environment, and increases the kind of increases the biodiversity essentially. And for me, this is a really interesting way to start thinking about an exhibition that targets a non-human audience, and starting to think beyond the human. You know, as a curator, the curatorial act can be an ecological one, I think. So yeah, for me, in terms of my research, that's one of the avenues I think is really interesting to think about.
And this also feels like it lends a voice to part of what I'm doing as well. Like in the earlier slides that I presented, recently I've been putting out my works outdoors because I believe that the non-human audience has a right to art, and it's not just for the visualization, but also to see what happens when this material disintegrates, how it's interacting with the birds or the insects or the animals in the environment, and what that is doing in terms of like nurturing the environment, how that kind of impact. So I think I love that idea. And I would add, Sarah, that perhaps also thinking about how the museum's outreach can get to underrepresented communities, where even as these sustainable content being celebrated and instated, that we make sure that they get to the underrepresented communities who don't often see art and who are not educated in that sense, to be more exposed and more involved in this ideology and in the process of becoming more sustainable.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the presentation of these kind of exhibits in sort of parks or public gardens, it definitely does increase the opportunities for engagement with people that are not ordinarily going to an art gallery. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you both. I love this line of conversation because I think it opens up so many opportunities, again, for new ways of thinking outside of the white cube. And really expanding our practice. There's a few questions coming in that I want to try to address. I also just want to say an important note that it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution to sustainability, right? And you have to reconcile best practices with the reality, right? And sometimes we'll find that sustainability is running counter to initiatives supporting DEI priorities, for instance, or surrounding cultural property. And we could have a whole conversation about that. But a question did come in regarding a recent Picasso exhibition I did, and whether environmental awareness and consciousness of scale significant factors in the content and focus. And without elaborating upon, folks who may or may not have seen that show, I think this is a really good example in this, one size does not fit all, and thinking through our impact. For an artist like Picasso, who's already had a lot of visibility, we kept the show very small, 10 works, and we looked to local loans. We thought through reuse of wall construction. We were really put this heightened sustainability lens on that exhibition as a case study. In other instances, for instance, we have a Korean avant-garde experimental art show on view right now that's much more significant in scale. Yes, we have loans coming from Asia. Yes, there was a lot of travel and research involved with that show, but that is a really critical show showcasing artists that haven't had a lot of visibility. So how can we find, these are opportunities to lean on our sustainability values in a really big way. But these are instances where there's an urgency, there's a need to tell the story, to bring these artists here, to have that movement and travel. Nana, what we were talking about earlier, sometimes it's actually really critical that you're there in person, and then other times it's not. So how can we kind of balance those different concerns? And again, that's all goes back to the conversation, right? As long as you're having the conversations and teasing through why you're making certain choices, then you can kind of get to the bottom of it. Someone also had a question about traveling exhibitions, and I'm not sure if that's something that folks feel equipped to respond to, but just in general, traveling exhibitions, any comments from the panelists? I think here they're probably thinking of both exhibitions that have multiple venues or package shows, so to speak, that go out into the world from an institution. If anyone wants to comment on that, otherwise I can dive in. Yeah, Kim, go ahead.
Sure, I can. Yeah, I mean, I'm not opposed to traveling exhibitions per se, although I'm a big proponent of degrowth and sort of it's like fewer exhibitions for longer periods of time. Also, something in our previous conversation I wanted to add in is or to throw out there is, are there artworks that maybe like we shouldn't be shipping, right? Like maybe it takes so much so many resources to ship, like especially fragile artworks, or and this is also something for Nana to maybe to touch upon, but moving even beyond that, it's like, should artists start thinking about the construction of their artworks in relationship to shipping? If their artwork's going to be transported, like something that can be dismantled, or using lighter weight materials if possible, like this sort of thinking. But I feel like with enough planning, for example, using sea freight to ship artworks. I know in this, in the States, maybe it's train's a whole different story, but the sea freight, it's reduces the carbon emissions by 80 to 90%, right? So if there's enough planning and there's time that allowed for the shipment of traveling exhibition by sea freight or by other means, by train, electric vehicle, and the planning kind of was in place for it, then you would see drastic cuts in carbon emissions. But it's like the time that's maybe this exhibition's on traveling for 3 years, with how long it takes to ship with sea freight across the world. But that needs to be a shift in our thinking as well, that things take more time in terms of sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please.
I think I just want to add to Kim's comment about ways that we can mitigate some of the shipping and transportation costs. That not necessarily about the traveling exhibitions, because I'm not a curator, but I've also adopted this method where I send instructions and recipes of my work to different locations across the world so that they can make it there, and like you said, it's important sometimes to be present, but where it is possible to have online engagements or kind of direct things from here, or have a cross venue kind of event happening at the same time, where maybe I gather a community here and we're kind of working together on something, and the community at the other side of the world, and we're working on the same thing, and we exchange ideas online, so it doesn't alienate me as an artist. But I think that there are ways that artists can rethink how we're shipping, especially those fragile arts pieces that can be easily either redone there or localized to the area, so that they can find the materials there and reproduce them. I think that also helps to cut out all of that shipping and transportation costs and the emission impact on the planet.
I also, oh gosh, we've got so many wonderful questions that we are not going to get to all of them, so my apologies in advance. But I did want to think through this idea of this emerging generation, right? That the youth audiences, youth activists, et cetera, are so critical to our future in this way of thinking. And Sarah, and then in your capacities, you're educators too. And I'm curious if there's anything that stands out to you about the way these emerging cultural workers, audiences, communities are thinking about the climate crisis and their practice in relation to the climate crisis. And then on top of that, how do you work to cultivate hope and resiliency for yourself and for your students?
I think this is a really important point. I mean, first, through my experience, there's a real appetite among students to engage with sustainability and climate crisis and embed sustainability into their practices. So, I mean, that fills me with optimism. There's a big appetite to kind of move forward with that. I think in the classroom, as you sort of hint at, there's always this delicate balance between navigating kind of despair and hope, and trying to sort of empower students rather than sort of leave them feeling despondent. And I think that actually climate anxiety is really growing. I think this does affect quite a lot of young people. And so for me, it's really important to facilitate conversation about this and create spaces where students can develop their understanding, think about the issues, think about their futures. And the seminar room can be a really great place for this to occur. But there's also some really interesting research that's been emerging about moving beyond the traditional classroom to kind of do this work into spaces like the gallery, the museum, maybe the sculpture garden, taking things outdoors, engaging with the public realm and the natural environment through teaching. And so I think that these kinds of shifts can be really helpful in terms of facilitating a different way to creatively and critically think through these kinds of ideas.
I think that for me, one of the things I try to triangulate in my approach to teaching, especially about sustainability, is to embody this eco pedagogical practice that speaks to the violence against others and the fact that students have the power to push back against violence on other people, on non-humans and things like that through their own practice. And so I've been agitating in my classroom to think about the life cycle of the materials that we're using and the communities that this life cycle practices are impacting, especially the communities of colors, immigrant communities, low-income communities that have industries built and a lot of wasteful products kind of coming to their or harming them, health-wise or in the health context. And so I've been preaching about this idea of think about what you're using, think about how these materials have a long-term effect on the environment and on people. And so if you're able to sort of figure out a way around that of being ethical in your practice and using alternative materials that are either eco-friendly or eco-efficient or biodegradable, that also serves to kind of contribute to sustainability in a very lived way. And the other thing too that I want to add is also this idea of indigenous practices and the wisdoms that we can attain from that. That has also been a big highlight of my teaching practice of recent, where I've been really trying to get students to glean off of a lot of indigenous practices and indigenous knowledge, because I think that the Western knowledge has really choked us up to only see things in a linear way and not look beyond the very material consumption that we practice today. And I think that has helped me feel a sense of gratification and also give my students some empowerment so that they feel that they can make a difference in their own little ways. And so we're not always using materials, for instance, that are synthetic, but we're also using materials that are do it yourself, homemade kinds of things. I think that those little things are really helping to make a difference.
Great, thank you. We are nearing the end of the webinar. I'm so grateful to Nana, Sarah, Kim for this rich discussion. And thank you to AMC and the EPIC Program Fellows for organizing this critical program and inviting us to participate. I'm just going to very quickly pull out some key takeaways that we can all kind of take back to our practices, to our institutions. Remember, first and foremost, that small impact can lead to big change. I hope we've underscored that, that institutions of various scales and budgets can make strides towards mitigating environmental impact and building climate resilience. One doesn't need to be perfect. In the absence of resources, we can work towards doing better. It's about rethinking our relationship to the land. And how does this start? Again, question everything, conversations, thinking forward, thinking through more sustainable exhibition materials, circularity. You heard that again and again. How can we think through reusing and reducing? Mindful shipping of both artwork, staff travel, etc. And resiliency planning for collections, institutions, communities. And it's really about getting to a place where sustainability is embedded in our practices. And then we'll be naturally doing things that are climate positive. Secondly, I just want to underscore how beneficial it is to collect stakeholders. This could be forming a staff-led cross-departmental green team. It could be training programs, socializing your sustainability values with artists, vendors, talking institution to institution, and really putting pressure collectively on your vendors. Collaboration and communication being key. And the earlier we start those conversations, the more sustainable decisions we can make across the board. Finally, last but not least, environmental justice and social justice being intertwined. And I appreciate you raising that at the end. It is vital to consider that local communities, and the ways in which historically marginalized communities are often those first and most negatively impacted by systemic environmental and social injustice. So thanks again to our speakers. I'm going to welcome Emma back for a quick closeout. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, and to each of our speakers for such a wonderful webinar today. Megan for moderating, and Kim, Nena, and Sarah for sharing your insights and taking the time for this important conversation. I know it's something a lot of people are talking about right now, and hopefully we'll be able to circle back to this topic because there is a need for this conversation. I'll keep this brief because we've gone over a bit, but I do want to acknowledge all of the work that went into putting this webinar together. It was entirely organized by the cohort of AAMC Foundation's Engagement for International Curators program, with generous support from the Art Fund. Without them, we really wouldn't be here today, and we're incredibly grateful. I do just want to quickly call out each fellow of the program who are all in the background of this Zoom, as they really were the ones that came up with the topic and helped find these wonderful speakers. We have Niv Allen at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Rosalind McKeever at the V&A, Kimberly Gant at Brooklyn Museum, Beatriz Lobo Brito at Innova, Francesca Dubrock at the Anchorage Museum, and John Kenneth Pernada at the Sainsbury Center for Visual Arts. And of course, thank you to all of our attendees. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day or evening or wherever you are in the world. We're so glad you were able to join us. This webinar has been recorded and will be on our YouTube. So if you want to circle back, watch it again, pull out key takeaways, it will be up, and I will be emailing a link to that to everybody in attendance and who registered but may not have been able to make it. And with that said, thank you all again.